Hello and welcome to the HEC HR Impact Webinar Series presentation. Today we'll be going over the path to I-9 compliance. Can you survive an audit? Brought to you through our partners, Form I-9 Compliance, LLC. I am Danielle Schleiman, your moderator and sales representative with HEC. Leading the presentation today will be Thomas Brechtel. Thomas is the Executive Vice President at Form I-9 Compliance, where he has been the senior member of the executive team since its founding in 2004. Thomas holds a law degree as well as a Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration, Management, and Operations. He brings nationally recognized expertise in the areas of Form I-9 and E-Verify compliance and is a highly requested speaker and presenter in these fields. Thomas's firsthand knowledge and expertise in the field of I-9 and E-Verify compliance has positioned him as an unparalleled subject matter expert in these industries. Thomas and his team translate complex immigration laws and employment eligibility requirements into the most legally compliant and easy-to-use employment eligibility solutions available. It is our pleasure to have Thomas here with us today to present to you on the path to I-9 compliance. Can you survive an audit? Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danielle, and welcome. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the Form I-9 and the opportunity to audit your Form I-9 so that if you are served a notice of inspection, you can rest assured that you've done everything possible to remediate the errors on the I-9 forms. And we are also going to talk about electronic capture. We all know that Rapid I-9 has an electronic I-9 linked to E-Verify, but you must capture your historical records prior to using the Rapid I-9 system so that you have a single database that you can go to and monitor compliance with. And then we're going to talk a little bit about consulting services. Then we're going to go through and talk about risk reduction and questions and answers. Danielle went over my experience. We partner with Rapid I-9, and we offer the electronic I-9, E-Verify, auditing, electronic capture, and consulting services through the Rapid I-9 system. Now, the fiscal year, this is 2013, and these are the latest numbers provided by ICE and Homeland Security Investigations. So this is for the fiscal year 2013. Employers were assessed over $26 million in civil and criminal fines for immigration-related violations. Now, that number is not all related to the Form I-9. There's other violations that encompass that $26 million. However, related to the Form I-9, there were 452 criminal arrests, and 179 of those individuals were owners, managers, supervisors, or human resource employees. This means that, you know, the VP of Human Resources was one that was actually criminally arrested for certain violations related to the Form I-9. A notice of inspection is served on an employer. It could happen at any time. There's no rhyme or reason for it. It could come from any aspect. But when you're served a notice of inspection, you're required within 3 business days, as stated on the notice, to provide the ICE or Homeland Security investigator your I-9 forms, along with any supporting documents related to what is contained on the notice of inspection. That's 72 hours. After that, they will come back and pick up the I-9 forms and take them and audit them. What happens, there's a sequence of events that happen after the notice of inspection. There's a notice of technical errors we'll get to in a moment, and then there's a notice of intent to fine, and finally there's a final order. There were 637 final orders. Some notices of inspection, some take longer to complete depending on the size of the audit. So you got 637 final notices. They total over $15 million in administrative fines, and 277 businesses were debarred for administrative and criminal violations. So that's a fiscal year overview of what's going on related to the I-9 form, which is the form required of all employees upon acceptance of an offer. All employees must have a completed I-9 form on file, and the employer must have that available. And one thing we must understand about the I-9 form, it's a living, breathing document. It's not a document that you can just complete and put in a file cabinet. It has to be monitored. Expiring documents need to be looked at. You know, when somebody terminates, you can purge the I-9 form based on certain parameters. So it's not something you can just put in the file cabinet and leave. It has to be maintained. The best way to maintain it is to capture it, audit them, your paper, capture them, and have a dashboard that gives you a complete overview of your historical records and usage of the electronic I-9 with E-Verify and or not E-Verify, depending on what you need to do. This shows how the notices of inspection are increasing back from 2007. You'll see that it's a forward, the arrow is going up, and it's just going to continue to go up as worksite enforcement and immigration, everything's at the top of the news now. You're going to see that that's going to continue to rise. So nobody is safe from receiving a notice of inspection. As a result, a best practice is to use an electronic I-9, create standard operating procedures, audit your historical records, and capture those so that if you are served a notice of inspection, it's very easy. You contact A-Check, we pull and export of the information, we deliver that to you so you can provide that to the auditor. We will happily demonstrate the system and go over your standard operating procedures with the auditor. We've had some circumstances where I've had discussions with an auditor. Somebody received a notice of inspection. I've had discussions with the auditor, and they, based on what we have provided them, they have elected just to audit historical records and not the electronic I-9. The good news for that client was they had done an audit on the historical records 3 years ago, and they were more than happy to provide them to the auditor. Administrative fines, you'll see how these have increased. Since 2009, which is almost zero, it's gone up to over $15 million. It's just going to continue to escalate. There's a lot of money there available because we all know that a lot of employers cannot adequately maintain their I-9 database. That's the reason an electronic database is not an option. It's something you must do. You just must do it. Increase in penalties. There was a 2009 directive by Homeland Security, ICE, Homeland Security Investigations, that shifted the enforcement effort to the employer as opposed to the employee. It is the employer's responsibility to make sure that their I-9 forms are done timely, they're stored, and they're maintained. So the onus is on the employer. You may find that you have an employee that's not authorized to work. That happens. You know, you can't be a document expert, but the employer is ultimately responsible for their I-9 records. So if you have 1,000 employees, you are responsible for those. And again, they're a living, breathing document that must be maintained. Some of the latest worksite enforcement news that's been on the USCIS website is, example, Utah hotel chain forfeits nearly $2 million for hiring illegal workers. It was out there. It's right off their website. Kansas City owner sentenced to 21 months for employing illegal aliens. Homeland Security investigation leads to largest worksite enforcement forfeiture in ICE history. That was back in September of 14. Chicago area company fined more than $300,000 for hiring illegal workers. The bottom line here is just to identify that they are out there, they are auditing employers, and what you need to do is get ready for, you have to take a proactive approach to your I-9s, not a reactive approach, because there's no physical way. If you get a notice of inspection within 3 days, you're going to be able to get everything ready. There's a lot of times they will extend that time frame depending on certain circumstances, but most of the time, 3 business days, they'll be back and expect your I-9 form. That is not the time to start auditing them, because if you audit them then, you're going to initial and date the corrections, and it's going to know, they're going to know that it was after the notice of inspection. They expect you to maintain a compliant I-9 database. The business case for I-9 auditing. We're just going to go through some of the parameters that identify why you should audit your I-9 forms. And whether this is whether you're using all paper, whether you're using electronic I-9 and paper, you have to maintain a compliant database. So these are some of the aspects of why you audit. You comply and understand the law. Auditing always comes up with patterns or practices on how an employer, and if you say you have 10 locations, each location is going to do their I-9s a little differently. And if they're storing their I-9s at the location and they're not centralized, you're not going to know what's there. So that's the reason if you go to the Rapid I-9 system, you're going to be able to monitor that through a dashboard. You can look at every single location uniquely, or you can look at the entire company. You're going to identify weaknesses in your I-9 processes and procedures. You know, what do you do? How does Section 3 get updated? What do you do if somebody is a rehire? What do you do if somebody changes their name? Et cetera, et cetera. These are all part of your standard operating procedures. That is a simple 1- to 2-page document that just outlines to everybody how you complete your I-9s and what the processes are. This is going to encompass training guidelines for all personnel, so that you identify the weaknesses and you train based on what needs to be trained on based on the audit of your I-9 forms. Your completion processes and procedures, how you terminate and your retention policies, re-verification processes, how is that somebody with an expired work document, how is that being updated? How are they being notified of that fact? Most of the time the I-9 is put in a file cabinet and it's never updated. That's a serious substantive error. This is going to help you guard against fines and penalties and give you the ability in an audit to remediate your technical violations. There's violations that are determined to be substantive and those that are technical. The violations are defined as any paperwork or procedural errors that occur with the Form I-9 process. They're classified, as I said, as either technical or substantive, and the test is whether a violation is technical or substantive lies in the seriousness of the error and whether or not it could have led to the hiring of an unauthorized alien. There's an opportunity, if you get a notice of inspection, that you will have, when you get the results back, you'll have 10 business days to correct the technical errors. 10 days. What we're trying to do is take a proactive approach and correct those now, and then give you training so they don't happen in the future. You're going to protect your company against unwanted negative publicity. You know, obviously, if somebody's audited and there's a fine, you saw those press releases on the previous slide. You don't want your name up there as somebody who wasn't doing their I-9 processes right. And bottom line, is going to establish good faith compliance with Homeland Security, that you're going to be identified as you did do an audit, you have tried to make the corrections, you have changed your processes and procedures based on the audit, and so forth. So those are all viable reasons on why somebody should audit their I-9 records. Self-audits, we've encompassed situations where the employer will say, well, we go ahead and the I-9s are sent to corporate, and we look at them and then we file them away. Again, they're going to think they're in pretty good shape. Self-audits typically result in more difficult situations than if the employer had somebody externally audit their forms. For example, there's monumental mistakes that can be made when you're correcting I-9 forms. Having the same individual or team of individuals do the self-audit, they're the ones that completed the I-9 form. So I don't know what they're going to be able to look at when they're looking at, you know, the original I-9 that they've done. Not checking information in Section 1 against supporting documents. And supporting documents are those documents that the employee used and gave you, original documents, to complete Section 2. Somebody gives you documents, you have the opportunity to maintain photocopies of those with the I-9 record. But you must check the information in Section 1 with Section 2. That's the advantage of an electronic I-9 system, because it cross-references citizenship status with the documents that can be used in Section 2. It's not telling the employee what documents to present, but it is saying that if you tell me you're a U.S. citizen, you cannot give me a permanent resident card as a List A document in Section 2. Making changes on the I-9 form without initial and dating the forms. You know, it's a best practice to, if there's an omission, add the information, initial and date the ad. If there's a discrepancy, cross out the information so that it's legible what was behind, line it out, and then make the change and initial and date the change. Remember, the employee can only correct those Section 1, and the employer or the representative will make the corrections in Section 2 or Section 3. Inserting backdated information. I got some I-9 forms recently. We're doing an audit, and these were new I-9 forms, the 2-page form, but the employer representative was missing I-9s back in the 90s. They went ahead and backdated the new 2-page form into the 90s so that it looked like it was done timely. That's why there's versions of the I-9 form. You cannot backdate the I-9. You use the current dates, and you use the original data higher. Redoing I-9 forms and throwing away the originals always establish timeliness. If you do an I-9 form on a wrong version and it's done correctly, all you do is keep that original and fill out a new one or identify it on a memo what happened. Separating copies of supporting documents from the I-9s and throwing them away. We had a situation one time that the ICE auditor came in. The I-9s were provided, but at the top left-hand corner there was a staple mark on the I-9 form, which would tend to indicate there were supporting documents attached to the form. The employer had gone through and removed the supporting documents, and the HSI investigator came back and said, where are the documents that were attached to the I-9 form? So that's a typical example of you can look at an I-9 and ascertain a lot of times exactly what happened. Self-audits, bottom line is employers don't know what they don't know. Some are experts, some have a little knowledge, and some have really no knowledge. So that's the reason you conduct an audit by an external company, you understand your patterns or practices, and then going forward, you address those through training and process documents. Here's an example of a fine chart that identifies substantive errors and uncorrected technical. Remember, you have 10 business days upon receiving the I-9s back to correct technical errors. I'm not going to get into today what is a substantive, what is a technical. I gave you a brief definition of it. We can certainly go into more detail. Substantive cannot really be corrected. They're errors that are there. Technical are some minor errors that can be corrected. So if you have 1,500 current employees and you're audited by ICE, and the auditor determines that 30% of the I-9 forms contain a substantive or a technical error that wasn't corrected within the 10 days, the employer, using this chart, could ultimately be issued a notice of intent to fine. That's an intent to fine. You can challenge it in the amount of $605 per I-9 form, totaling over $272,000. I'm not saying that that's going to be the final fine. I'm saying that's what they have the opportunity on their notice of intent to fine to indicate the money they want. So that's what the chart is used. You have a first offense, second offense, third offense. You have a percentage of errors, substantive and uncorrected technical fine schedule. So it's very basic math. Everyone refers to this chart once the I-9 audit is completed. Then you have an enhancement matrix, and you can enhance those fines or mitigate the fines. So the factors are business size, good faith. Good faith is doing an audit, seriousness of the violations, the number of unauthorized aliens, your history of compliance, and a total. And each one can increase or decrease 5%, or it could be neutral and not change it. So if you conduct an audit, and obviously it's going to mitigate your fines at least 5%. So that gives you an indication on notice of inspection, the fine chart on a very basic overview, and the enhancement matrix where you can either aggravate or mitigate your fines. The I-9 audit is done where you send the paper I-9s, example here, the paper I-9s are sent. And we've developed an electronic auditing system. So what happens is an experienced auditor is going to go in, look at each I-9 form and cross-reference it with your payroll file, highlight the errors, review the documents if you maintain documents of the supporting documents. I do want to point out that it's a common practice that a lot of times if you do maintain copies of documents, you only maintain those documents that were used for the I-9 purpose. For example, if somebody gives me a driver's license, list B, Social Security card, list C, and a permanent resident card, list A, and I record the driver's license and the Social Security card as a B and C document, don't maintain a copy of that permanent resident card. It is a over-documentation of the supporting documents. Hand it back and just record the driver's license and the Social Security card, or in the alternative, record the list A permanent resident card and don't record the other two. But don't keep copies of everything. Only keep copies of what was used with the I-9 process. I see it all the time where people are over-documenting. Somebody gives a U.S. passport, and I got a copy of a U.S. passport, a driver's license, a Social Security card, and their insurance card or something else that's irrelevant to the I-9. All they want to see is what was done with the I-9 and what was used if you maintain those copies. And if you maintain copies, maintain them for everybody. Be consistent. Don't be fragmented. Don't keep a copy of a driver's license and no social. You know, if you keep copies, keep them. We review the document photocopies. We are a document expert that can identify those documents that don't appear to be genuine, identify those to you, and go over what best practices could happen. So the audit's done, I-9 audit, I-9's received, highlighted, the information is inserted into the electronic auditing system, it spits out a result page, and this identifies and gives you step-by-step indication on how to correct the errors. And then we give a comprehensive page that shows where the patterns or practices are, and then we can address training going forward. Electronic capture. Now, once you've, well, I'm assuming that you're going to use the electronic I-9 through Rapid I-9, and then you have your paper I-9s, and you're doing an audit. Once you've done all the remediation possible, you're able to electronically capture these records. So what we do is we take an image of the record, and we index it for retrieval purposes. And when we index it, we're also looking at data hire and any expiring documents that require updating. So then it's all put in your database. So you're going to have immediate access to the records. You can destroy the paper. You're going to have a centralized database. The compliance dashboard is going to give you a comprehensive total on everybody you have working. You can manage deadlines enterprise-wide with expiring document alerts, Section 3 updates. Those are done electronically, not on paper. And you can terminate, and the system will purge the records automatically. You have reporting. You have, as we talked about, the audit support. If you receive a notice of inspection, we are not a law firm. However, we have experience dealing with ICE and Homeland Security investigators, and we can work in conjunction with your law firm on demonstrations, operating procedures, and so forth. Data security. It's all secure in a database. You don't have to worry about paper I-9s in a file cabinet. Customer support team, and recommended best practice, as we talked about, is the audit and the remediation. There is an opportunity, if you want to, where you can have the auditor during the auditing process actually help to remediate certain errors in Section 2 depending on what's provided. If you want more information on that, we can talk about that. What happens there is, very simply, the paper records and an index file, which is a payroll file that we use for cross-reference purposes, are all then centralized into the A-Check database, Rapid I-9. Best practice. Form I-9 consulting, business case. So the consulting services are critical to anyone trying to maintain a compliant I-9 database. And the consulting, auditing and remediation falls under consulting. The subject matter expertise and professional assistance. We can go over your completion processes, real-time advice on supporting document questions, E-Verify, if you use E-Verify, case closure statements and procedures, the deliverables based on a notice of inspection, and we can also participate with E-Verify desk reviews or site visits. If you use E-Verify, they have a monitoring division now that identifies where there's patterns or practices of not using E-Verify correctly. I've actually attended some of these site visits where E-Verify will call and say, hey, we've got some situations here going on. We need to discuss them with you. We're going to come and visit with you. Or they're going to do it over a conference call. But a site visit is where the auditor shows up. They go over what they've seen in the use of E-Verify, and they better want to understand what your practices are. Obviously, consulting services are additional fees, but we do participate in those if requested, if you're using the system. Form I-9 and E-Verify best practices. There are certainly best practices related to the use of an electronic I-9 and E-Verify or a paper I-9 process. That includes the Federal Acquisition Rule for federal contractors and the flow-down requirements and so forth related to that designation. Policy review, I talked about standard operating procedures. They are critical to an employer. They can be 1 page, they can be 2 pages, but everybody responsible for the I-9 form should have a standard document they can refer to and understand on how I-9s and or E-Verifies are completed. The monitoring services, we've identified the inability of a lot of employers because of their day-to-day activities. Even if you give them a dashboard and a database and an easy-to-reference indicators, they don't have the time or the expertise to effectively monitor what the dashboard says. This is in addition to turnover, people, new people come in. So we offer an outsourcing service that would actually, we would work with a single point of contact at the employer's level, and then we would effectively assist them in monitoring their I-9s, their E-Verify results, making sure receipts are updated timely, making sure expiring documents are being updated, so on and so forth. So that's an additional service that we've identified that is that needs to be implemented into the country based on what we've seen employers doing. Document review and verification services, we actually, for one company, we actually, an auditor reviews every single document that was used in the I-9 process. This means they use the electronic I-9, they upload color photocopies of the documents, for example, driver's license and a social, and then an auditor will then review them and pass or fail them based on their expertise. And then they'll go back and get different documentation. It is a very effective service, especially if you're serious about your I-9 processes. The electronic transition planning is critical. If you're going to move from a paper process to electronic, we have to identify what your processes are and how it can be done electronically. New hire procedures, remote hire solutions. A lot of employers have issues with that. We can identify what the options are and how you can use the electronic I-9 with those remote hires. Training and support, and customized reporting and communications if you need it. So the consulting side of the house encompasses the auditing, and it helps employers out there to maintain a compliant database. Next steps are your risk reduction. You know, I think these are standard questions we ask everybody. You know, when an employer is calling up and inquiring about, you know, the services. You know, the questions are, where are your I-9 stored? You know, you can all ask yourself these questions, and you might have an immediate answer to them. You may know that they're stored over there, and we know exactly what we're doing. But there's a lot of people that store them decentralized. There's a lot of people that haven't looked at I-9 forms in years. I had one company that has 18,000 current employees. They've grown tremendously. They had over 50,000 paper I-9 forms stored in the file cabinet that they hadn't looked at. They just kept putting them in the file cabinet. So we're actually doing an audit and cleaning up that mess for them. Do you know if your I-9s are compliant? Well, you know, if you're doing an internal or you've done an external audit, you'll know that they're as compliant as they can be. There's some errors, again, you cannot correct, but you can identify. Are you missing any I-9 forms? Do you have 10 how do you know that there's an I-9 form on file for everybody? How does somebody get on payroll? What is the process? Is the I-9 done, it's confirmed, and then they're put on payroll? Or are they put on payroll the first day and the I-9's never done? Remember, the I-9, Section 1 has to be done on or before the first day of employment, after offer acceptance. Section 2 has to be done by the third business day of employment. Those are the requirements. Most employers are not compliant with those requirements. Are you updating expiring work documents? How do you know that there's one? You know, the advantage of an electronic system, it's going to tell you. How about receipts? If somebody gives you a receipt, I lost my Social Security card. I went and got a receipt. Here's my receipt for List C. Certainly you can accept that, but in 90 days the employee is required to bring in their Social Security card, so you can update, remove the receipt designation. Are you purging your I-9s based on retention rules? You know, when somebody separates from the company, you can terminate that record. We will calculate 3-year, 1-year rule and purge it automatically, or you have the ability to go in, if you rehire somebody, unterminate, and do a new data hire in Section 3 based on certain requirements. And can you provide your I-9 records within the 72 hours if you get a notice of inspection? You know what, it's a risk that you may say, well, we're never going to get one. You know, nobody's safe from it. You know, it could come from disgruntled employees, past employees, current employees. It could come from a competitor. You know, all kinds of tips are coming in. There's no rhyme or reason for who receives a notice of inspection. As a result, you take a proactive approach and you address those concerns prior to getting one. You may never get one. The Form I-9, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of gray matter related to it. It's an I-9 form right now that gives you 6 pages of instructions for the 2-page form. You have the list of acceptable documents. You have a 66-page handbook for employers that offers guidance, not the law, it's guidance. You have an I-9 Central website that offers additional guidance. All this confusion is we've taken it all and given you an electronic I-9 that has the coding behind it to help you alleviate the errors and not have to look at all this information and try to ascertain what's wrong and what's right. And then if you have a question, you simply pick up the phone, contact HSI, and we will get you the answer. So the path to I-9 compliance we talk about is the electronic I-9, which will reduce errors, increase efficiency, improve your records management. There's audit trails associated with the electronic I-9. They're compliant with the final regulations. Improve your data security. There's corporate hierarchy options for setup. And you have the E-Verify option. E-Verify is the government database that confirms what's on the I-9 form. You cannot process E-Verify until an I-9 is done. We have the option to use E-Verify with the I-9. We're integrated directly with the I-9, so all you do is click a button. Or we have the option that you still complete a paper form and then process E-Verify directly as a standalone E-Verify. Again, it's all about what your processes and procedures are, and if we understand that, we can give you what the best practices are. So this is basically a slide that identifies everything you need to know. You know, there's a decision you make. That's the decision where you decide to use an electronic I-9. That's on the right side. So we establish processes, procedures, and you start using the electronic I-9, and then you have the optional E-Verify option. And then as a result, all your new hires are stored in an electronic database with expiring document alerts, everything you need, compliance dashboard. Over on the left side is your I-9 since the requirement came into effect in 1986. That's when the I-9. So if you have an employee that started in 1987, you should have an I-9 on file for him or her. What you do on the historical forms, we went through it in detail. You complete an audit, remediate to the best of your ability. knowing that in Section 1 has to be remediated by the employee, Section 2 and 3 by the employer or their authorized representative. You identify in a memo what was done. Then ultimately, we're going to take those forms, image them, index them, and put them into the database that your electronic I-9's in. As a result, you have a centralized, compliant I-9 E-Verify database. It's as simple as that. So the paths to compliance: electronic I-9, E-Verify, optional, audit, scanning and indexing. Then you have the optional consulting services, and we also do SSNBS, which is basically used for payroll purposes, where you could give us the names and socials of your current database. We could run them through the Social Security Administration database and identify any discrepancies related to that and give you best practices for addressing those. It's usually in conjunction with an audit, so that you can identify mismatches or socials that were never issued or any other discrepancies on that. Right now, I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. There was a lot of information there, but we can certainly go through your questions right now. Danielle?
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, we do have a whole lot of questions here. First one, how long do we keep I-9s for, and how long can we keep photocopies of I-9 documents?
If you maintain copies of the I-9 documents used for Section 2, you maintain them with the I-9 form, and you must keep the I-9 until the employee separates from the company or terminated, and then after that, you must keep it 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year after termination, whichever is later. For example, if I hired somebody in 2005 and they terminate today, I need to keep the I-9 for an additional year. If I hire somebody yesterday and they terminate today, I have to keep that I-9 from 3 years from yesterday. If you use the Rapid I-9 database, all you have to do is put in a termination date and not worry about calculating 3-year, 1-year rule. We'll do it for you. You keep the supporting documents with the I-9 as long as you keep the I-9 form if you maintain supporting documents.
Okay, next question. If we receive a notification from E-Verify that a document is or has expired after an employee has been employed, do we need to have the employee provide an unexpired document? If so, what is the time frame from the employee to bring it in?
You may be, it sounds as if this question comes from somebody using E-Verify and they have an expiring document notification in E-Verify. If you use it directly, the employee is required, if you get the notice, there's a expiration date on their work eligibility. Most of the time it's an alien authorized to work until. When that date happens and there's been no update, you have to implement your internal procedures, whatever they are. If you continue to employ that individual, you may be subject to knowingly continuing to employ an unauthorized worker. You need to know whether there's a temporary protected status indicated on that individual based on their country. So you need to update that I-9 form in Section 3 on or before that expiration date. So you notify the employee. We send out notices 90, 60, and 30 days. That is the usual time frame. The employee needs 90 days to complete an application to extend their work eligibility and ultimately receive their new document. They'll bring it in. So if you don't notify the employee, a lot of times they don't realize it. It won't be done. So that's another situation where you have to have internal policies. What happens if we have an employee whose document expired and we haven't received an updated document? I just went through this with another company that was not really looking at their dashboard, and they had at least 15 employees that had expired. So they basically gave the employee a few days to bring in their documents. All of them did, but we have to determine what your policies are when that happens.
Thank you. It was mentioned that when an employee is terminated, the I-9 should be purged. Can we purge terminated employees right at the same time they're terminated, or what's the suggested time frame to purge them?
There's not a suggested time frame. It's a requirement. The I-9, when somebody terminates, you apply a termination date to the I-9. You don't purge it on that date. Based on the termination date and the date of hire, you're required to keep the I-9 3 years from that date of hire or 1 year after termination, whichever's later. So when somebody terminates, you don't purge their I-9 immediately. You have to determine the 3-year, 1-year rule, and then after that time, you can purge that I-9 form. That's a requirement that's an opportunity for you to purge the record.
All right. Are I-9 ID updates needed for every single employee, even U.S. citizens?
No, we do not update. You do not update U.S. citizens or permanent residents based on expiration dates. The only individuals, there's certain documents that require updating, and most of the time, it's the category an alien authorized to work until, who would either ultimately give you a foreign passport with an I-94 or an employment authorization I-766. Those documents indicate limited work eligibility. There's an expiration date, and those are the individuals that you need to update. I just did, we're working on an audit right now in this company, and they have 8 divisions. One division was updating driver's licenses and permanent resident cards in Section 3. And that's something that needs to be addressed because it's something that they can't do legally update those documents. If my driver's license expired, you're not going to tell me, hey, you got to bring in a new one. It doesn't affect anything. It's not a requirement. If my permanent resident card expires, don't ask me to bring in a new one. But if my I-94 was limited or my I-766 had an expiration date, those are the documents that require updating. That's why the Rapid I-9 system, if it captures that information, it's going to send you automated alerts through email. It's going to identify it on the dashboard, and it's going to tell you which I-9s need to be updated. Instead of you having to guess, does this need to be updated or does this not to be updated? So it just makes sense to use an electronic database that does the work for you.
Thank you. What if you have multiple locations and an HR department is not present in every location? Is it acceptable to have new employees scan and send a copy of their IDs along with their completed Section 1 for the corporate office to complete?
Absolutely not. It is well established in Section 2 that the employer or an authorized representative personally touch the documents, review an original document, not a photocopy, identify that they appear to be genuine, and record that information in Section 2. In your situation, you're dealing with, I would assume, a remote hire who's never going to come into a brick-and-mortar location. In those circumstances, we have the opportunity for the employer to implement policies and procedures where there is somebody selected to identify and record the documents, and then those documents are sent to corporate. They're uploaded to the I-9 record, and E-Verify could be processed. So we have ways around that, but in your sequence, and a lot of employers are doing that, we've helped them alleviate that issue right now. But what you're doing right now is not legal based on I-9 requirements.
All right. What if a current form is electronic and the back form is current but printed from Adobe?
If we're using an electronic I-9 in the back form, I assume that question indicates that the historical forms have been captured in PDF. That's fine. I mean, if you still want to do an audit on them, but all you have to understand is if you memorialize your historical forms, you have to have the ability to, if you're asked for it, pull up the historical form. If I come in and say, hey, I want to see John Smith's I-9 form, you have to have the ability to go in and pull that form up. So that's why the indexing is required. I think more information is needed to effectively answer that question.
Okay, next question. If an employee has legally changed their name via marriage, divorce, etc., is an employer supposed to re-verify with their new name, regardless of their length of employment?
No, a name change, there's an optional in Section 3. It's not a mandatory requirement, but if somebody changes their name, you can certainly make it a policy that you identify that name change in Section 3. I think it is a best practice if I get a name change and somebody says, I just got married, you know, and my new name is this, that from an HR perspective, you require that they go provide a Social Security card as a verification of that name change, so that somebody may get married, they have a marriage certificate, identifies their name change, but they haven't changed their name in Social Security Administration, which will ultimately result in a no-match situation related to that I-9, related to that name and Social Security number. So some of the companies that we've consulted with have implemented an HR policy that says, if you do a name change, we require that you bring in a new Social Security card to effectively confirm that name change. You're not required to do it in Section 3. Is it a best practice? Probably is, to make sure that, you know, I-9s. And what I've seen a lot is that the employer will actually write the name change or put a sticky note on the I-9. But there are better processes that can be implemented. But you don't have to re-verify them. No, there's no re-verification requirement.
Thank you. Can an employer be fined more than once for the same error on one I-9? Does ICE keep a list of all these I-9s that are audited?
Absolutely. They'll keep a list of what was done. Would you be, if you were fined on an I-9 form and ultimately you couldn't go back and make the corrections or something? No, you wouldn't be fined again on that I-9 form, but they would look at you as a possible employer that would do the same errors on new I-9 forms. But if you're fined on a specific I-9 form for something you could not correct, you cannot go back because there's no way for you to correct it. You can't go back and have double jeopardy on that I-9 form.
Thank you. Can an employer maintain the supporting documents separately from the I-9, or must the supporting documents be attached to the I-9?
Well, I think you can certainly maintain them separately, but I think that, you know, if you're let's say you receive a notice of inspection and you've got all your I-9 forms and then you've got all the supporting documents, what you're going to have to do, because they're going to ask you, do you maintain on the notice and any supporting documents related to the I-9 process? So you've got two separate databases, and what you're going to have to do is go in and collate them all at that time. So I think it's a best practice to keep it with the I-9 record so you have it readily available.
Thank you. This one kind of goes with the other question. We were under the impression that we did not have to maintain copies of all supporting documents. Is that true?
Absolutely. That's your choice, unless you're in the state of Colorado, and Colorado has a Department of Labor requirement that requires employers within the state to maintain photocopies of the documents used in the I-9 completion process within 20 days, and plus you have to complete an affirmation. And if you use E-Verify, you must maintain certain documents from List A because of the photo tool. Those documents are a U.S. passport, permanent resident card, or an employment authorization document. Those documents, the picture used to create the document shows up on the E-Verify screen, and you're identifying that they match exactly. They just want verification that they matched exactly, so you have to keep a copy of that document. So there's no requirement that you keep copies of documents. Is it a best practice? Perhaps, but there are state of Colorado and there are E-Verify requirements related to that. If you are using E-Verify, you're only required to maintain those List A documents used for the photo tool. You don't have to maintain the others. But if you maintain photocopies, if that's your practice, you must do it for everybody the same way.
Thank you. Are all of these documents provided Are all of these documents provided electronically? Doesn't that go against how an I-9 needs to be completed? So no hard copies are needed if you have an I-9 electronic capture.
That's correct. If you capture the form electronically, in 2005 the regulations came into play. We coded the I-9 form. All you have to do is maintain a compliant audit log behind the form. So you complete it online, it's stored online, it's updated online, and if you're asked to deliver an I-9 form that was completed online, we deliver a PDF package of every single I-9 form along with all the information required per employee. And you can, you know, in the last notice of inspection I just went through, we delivered the file electronically. The auditor came in and took a thumb drive of the information and went away so they could review it. So there's no requirement that you keep a paper I-9 form.
Thank you. Is the database something we maintain or HSI maintains?
HSI maintains your database. All the code and everything is on the servers. All the information is stored. It's securely stored. There's a backup system implemented if there was some issue. It's secure, and it gives you immediate access to it. So you don't have to worry about it. It's just a matter of signing up, identifying what your procedures are, and doing some training and getting up and running.
Thank you. What guidelines do you use to be compliant for electronic forms? Do you not see many guidelines from the USCIS or for electronic forms? So where do you get the guidelines, or does have the USCIS have an extensive guideline for electronic forms?
There's published guidelines related to the interim and the final regulations for the completion of an electronic I-9. So there's certain requirements that we had to adhere to. Initially, it was the interim regs, and that's all related to the, it's published July 22nd, 2010, the final regs. The effective date was August 23rd, 2010. In 2005, the interim regulations came out, but it's part of Title 8, Part 274A, and there's specific sections in there, and there's Section 2, Standards for Electronic Retention of Form I-9, the documentation, the security, the electronic signatures for the employee, employer. Everything related to what needs to happen, including the audit log. So we audit log the completion of the I-9. So we're capturing who's completing it, who's typing the information in, their IP address, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a log behind the creation of the I-9 form. So absolutely, we have followed the guidelines to a T, and we are a compliant electronic I-9 that will withstand any audit scrutiny that could ever come about.
Thank you. Next question. My company uses an HR shared drive in our network. Only HR has access to it, and we are thinking of scanning in all of our I-9s there. Is this compliant? If not, why not?
Yeah, sure. You know, you could memorialize your I-9, your historical I-9s anywhere you want. You just have to understand that there are certain requirements. If you do that, you have to index them. You have to effectively know hire date, term dates, and purge them based on what their requirements are. And you need to be able to identify expiring documents and give the ability outside probably the HR shared drive, if somebody else is reviewing the updated document, to go in there and update Section 3, or they could, I guess, do it on a paper form and send it in to you. So there's, as long as you have access, if you want to store them on your HR shared services drive, I don't see any problem with that.
Thank you. Can an employer decide to just re-I-9 all of their employees if they discover their original forms are a mess?
Certainly. I mean, that is always an option. I think prior to doing that, depending on the size of the employer, you will always keep the originals. Even though they're a mess, you will memorialize the Re-I-9 project. You will come out with an effective communication to all employees on why you're doing it and that nobody's being discriminated against. You will give them a timeline to bring in their documents, and you will effectively be able to complete a new I-9, attach the original I-9, use the original data hire on the new I-9 with the current dates, and go through that. That's always an option if you elect to do it, but it has to be well thought out and well implemented.
Thank you, Thomas. This is the last question. With immigration reform up in the air, is it really necessary to audit one's I-9 records at this point?
Well, that's a you know what, that's a great question, and you know I think what we can ascertain from immigration reform is I just had a client receive a notice of inspection in November, and I had a couple receive them earlier last year. I've had nobody receive one yet this year. You know, it's all a matter of rolling the dice. I know that, you know, Homeland Security Investigations has 25,000 individuals. I know that the fines are increasing. I don't see any rhyme or reason for them to stop auditing I-9 records. Remember, they're auditing the employer. You know, if somebody comes up and they're not eligible to work or they're applying for certain status under the reform, if that goes through, you know, there's always a lot of branches off the audit itself. I just don't know if I would take that chance. I think I would want to make sure at this time, if you consider this to be a lull time, I think I'd take this time to get my ducks in a row. And if I do an I-9 audit, it's something that I know that the I-9 is required. It's required. It's a federally required document. I must maintain it. It must be compliant. If I'm sitting back and waiting for immigration reform, I may be waiting for a long time. But I know that we have received, and we do have clients that have received notices of inspection as recently as November. So I don't think these people have things to do, these Homeland Security investigators, and they are effectively responding to tips and information related to employers that aren't doing things right.
Thomas, we do have a few other questions, if you don't mind. A couple more?
Sure.
Okay. How does ICE determine which companies will be audited?
There's, as I said earlier, there's no rhyme or reason. You know, I've seen situations where a disgruntled past employee is called on his employer, or a disgruntled current employee is called on his employer, or they've made a situation out of an employee and they've terminated an employee, and he knows there's other people there that shouldn't be there. It comes from SSA no-match letters. You know, every year SSA sends out situations where, hey, we've got all these discrepancies in your database, and if you don't take care of those are breadcrumbs to Homeland Security investigations. And it just comes from past inspections, and they also look at certain industries that they know would be easy prey to find out that there's a lot of I-9 violations there. At the end of the day, what they're looking for is not only the employment of unauthorized workers, but also for the revenue that it's going to generate.
Thank you. Should the completed I-9 be filled where the employee is physically located? We have some employees that are considered virtual employees at our location, but their personnel files are located in a different location.
Well, bottom line is the employee has to fill out Section 1, and the employee has to meet with somebody, provide documents from the list, and have somebody record their documents to confirm their identity and employment authorization. if an employee is virtual, they still have to fill out Section 1 and they still have to get Section 2 completed. Where that I-9 is stored is irrelevant to where that employee is. It just has to be stored and maintained.
Thank you. What documents do you need to check for expiration dates, all or just certain ones?
Well, we went over this one. It's the most prominent are the aliens authorized to work, List A, the employment authorization document, the I-766 that has limited work eligibility, or somebody with a foreign passport with an I-94 based on their designation. Their work eligibility will be limited, and if they're a student classification, it'll be contained within their CVIS record and so forth. So most prominent, without getting more into detail on this call, but it's the situation in Section 1, alien authorized to work until that date, those individuals, or if it's in Section 2, those dates, most of the time under List A in Section 2, or you've got the catch-all in List C, number 8, those are the individuals that require updating. Good news here is if you go to the Rapid I-9 system, we'll capture those dates for you and take all the work off your hands.
Thank you. How can we document that I-9s were destroyed during an office fire?
Clearly, you'll have history of the fire. You'll have probably a fire report, and you'll create your internal memo that, unfortunately, on this date and time, we had a fire, and all our I-9s were destroyed. As a result, we went back and re-I-9'd everybody using their original date with current dates for completion purposes.
Thank you. Do you have an example of a memo we could use, or if we decide to do a self-audit? What do you do when you realize that there is a missing I-9?
Well, yeah, we have examples of memo, but you'd have to get a hold of A-Check, and we'd have to understand exactly what you're addressing. If you find that there's a missing I-9, you notify the employee based on an audit. We revealed that we never completed an I-9 form for you. Here's the list of acceptable documents. Please bring in a document from List A or List B and C within the next 7 days so we can meet with you and complete your missing I-9 record.
Thank you. If an associate employment authorization expired and they show me just the receipt of the biometrics process stamp when it was taken, do I need an end to their employment till they provide the unexpired update ID?
Yeah, those documents, the notice of actions, the 797Cs, the biometric appointment and this and that, do not confirm anything except they went to an appointment or they have an appointment. It's basically there's no approval, and it says on the top, this does not identify any immigration status. So I think it's dependent upon, there is a USCIS case status site that you can go in and put in their case number and identify where in that status it is. So I think there's a lot of questions to be answered prior to the fact that, you know, if the employee, I just had this situation happen, as a matter of fact. The employee provided a notice of action for an appointment. However, that was back in December. They had an email and so forth, but there was no update to it since December. The USCIS case status site didn't have any update except for the December date. As a result, the employee was terminated. That was the HR policy for that company. They didn't put them on suspended leave, which would be an opportunity too until they brought in their document. They conferred that there were no temporary protected status countries effective with their documents, so they terminated the employee. Ultimately, if the employee hasn't provided updated information, or unless they've waited more than 75 days, they can call InfoPass and try to get more information. They don't have work eligibility until you receive their document.
Thank you. Our company is in Colorado. We keep List A docs with the I-9 and affirmation. We keep List B and C documents with only the affirmation. Would you consider this a best practice?
Well, I think I don't know why you would keep List A documents with the affirmation and the I-9 and List B with just the affirmation. You need to keep the affirmation and the documents with the I-9 record for both List A or List B and C.
How would you convert your current paper I-9 forms to an electronic I-9 form to start using electronic I-9 forms going forward?
We talked about that in one of those slides. You would send us all your paper I-9s. You'd send them to HSI, and then we would go through, and best practice, you should audit them. Before I memorialize forms, I want somebody to look at them so I don't memorialize flawed forms. But if you don't elect to audit, your choice, we would then scan the I-9 form, index it, and put it in the database so that you would have a scanned database and an electronic I-9 database on your dashboard, and you would have everything captured.
Thank you. You mentioned the remote hire process that is available with Rapid I-9. Can you go over that one more time, please?
Sure. There's 3 or 4 options for remote hires. Without the use of, unless you use notaries, I don't know, but there's certainly well-established guidelines that employer can use anybody they choose to complete Section 2 on their behalf. One of the advantages of using electronic I-9 is that person is going to complete an electronic I-9, record the documentation, and then the documents are sent to corporate. They'll get them, they'll upload them to the record, and then they can process E-Verify if they're using it. I think more discussion has to be had to determine exactly what type of remote hires you have and exactly what your current process is now. Most companies like to indicate that they use a notary. There's a lot of problems related to notaries. One is the price. 2 is their ability to effectively understand what they're doing with the I-9, that they're not acting as a notary. They're acting as a representative of the employer. We don't need their notary stamp anywhere, certainly not on the I-9 record. We just need them to act as an authorized representative. So if you use the notaries, that's great. They can do this. But if you have the opportunity to use anyone you select, I have companies that have situations with remote hires that are using a friend, neighbor, or spouse to act as the employer representative, and the employer is more than happy to do that, because if not for that opportunity, they would, like a question was earlier, they would have the employee sending copies of documents through a fax and never seeing the light of day with anybody verifying who they are and what they're doing. So there's several options available, and we can certainly have more in-depth discussion on that.
Thank you. If you meet the criteria for purging, do you recommend physically destroying the I-9 docs? What do you mean by purging?
Physically destroying the I-9 records. Tearing them up, shredding them, whatever.
Sorry about that. We just recently started using E-Verify and no longer keep copies of supporting documents. We have in the past when we were not using E-Verify. Should we go back and E-Verify those employees and destroy those supporting documents?
Well, if you're using E-Verify, you have to maintain the List A documents we talked about earlier. That's mandated in your memorandum of understanding. You cannot go back and ask people for photocopies after the fact. You have to just identify what the issue is now, and moving forward, do the right thing and memorialize that in a memo that you realized that you weren't doing things correctly, And as a result, here's the memorandum, and moving forward, we're going to do things correctly. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. This is the last question. Just to confirm, if we find that we do not have an I-9 for an employee, we can send them an entirely new I-9 to fill out, correct? If so, when e-verifying them, what would we put for the reason that this was completed so late?
To confirm, that is correct. The I-9 can be done now. Give the employee time to provide their documents, use their original date of hire, and their current date of completion. You'll have somebody meet with them and confirm their documents. When you e-verify that individual, you want to, one, make sure that that date of hire was after you signed your MOU. If it was, your memorandum of understanding with e-verify. If it was, you will enter the information in e-verify. When that comes up, you'll get a pop-up that appears that's going to ask why it's outside the 3 days. You will identify it as other, and you will write down I-9 with audit revealed I-9 was missing, I-9 was completed on this date, and process the case.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for presenting today, and thank you all that have joined us. We have received several questions that we're not able to get answered all on air. We will be answering all questions, and we will email them back to you directly. This presentation as well will be available on HCHEC Global, as well as our other webinars that we have done last year. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed our HCHEC presentation on I-9 compliance and can you survive an audit. And we will hope that you join us next year, or sorry, on our next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.